Mind, I'm not preaching anything contrary to accepted morality. I'm not advocating free love in this or any other case. Society must go on, I suppose, and society can only exist if the normal, if the virtuous, and the slightly deceitful flourish, and if the passionate, the headstrong, and the too truthful are condemned to suicide and madness. I had a very interesting month of reading in September. September is often one of my worst months because I find it very fatiguing and exhausting, and another line from The Good Soldier in which I was quoting is, "It might sound romantic, but it's just an exercise in fatigue." And I feel like that represents my September. The Good Soldier is probably my only full-length novel that I actually really enjoyed this month, which is pretty sad. I read 11 and I had some mixed thoughts about all of them pretty much. So let's get into this. I'm Kayla Scribner. This is my reading wrap up for September of 2021, and these are the 11 books that I read. The first book that I finished this month was The Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. I thought this was really good. I thought it was a really solid exploration and kind of rehistorying what we think of as absolute points, what we think about as she really spends a good job of going through and being like, okay, this is how we perceive this situation and how this situation actually happened, giving voices and recognition. And she does a really good job of revealing the sinister behind the patriotic. And it's just really, really well done. My biggest issue is that this came out in the Obama years, and I think for that reason, there's this kind of height and idea that like a lot of these issues have been resolved and that a lot of things are doing really well. And you know, we have improved since many years ago, but not nearly enough. It has been stalemate, especially for Indigenous people, especially for, you know, First Nations. They have spent so many years and they're continually dismissed and discriminated against continually. So I think that even though this was a really good job of elevating the past, I think that it had a little bit, I don't want to say hopeful because I think that it's really important to be hopeful. I just think that if it had come out in 2020 or 2021 instead of 2013, she would have been much more hard on a lot of the things of contemporary things rather than more than forgiving than she is. The next book on here is The Good Soldier, and this is the book that I started with the quote. I really love this. This is a book that came out in 1914 and I really loved. It's really satirical and it takes it the Edwardian society in England where we have these people and like pretty much the premise is this guy is like a good soldier and he's like narrating this life of his friend and he's like, he's a good soldier, he's a good husband, he's like my best friend. Also, he's been sleeping with my wife for 7 years and I didn't know. So it's really like trying to uncover how the protagonist and the narrator is really telling the story. The quote at the beginning is very telling of his style because he's talking about like, yes, I'm not talking about society. I'm talking about how everyone's sleeping with everyone and everyone's pretending to be, oh, perfect at the same time. But he's like, I'm not going to tell you that like this is how society should be. You know, in the end, of course, everyone is going to die or, you know, become unstable, at least by the eyes of society, because that is how we must reward people who step outside of the bounds of society. And it's just really interesting and really good. And I'm really sad that it's like an underrated book that no one reads anymore. So probably because I was in morality tales time, I started The Scarlet Letter, and this was an interesting book. I have a video coming up that I filmed like 3 weeks ago and I haven't edited, so we'll have that soon. But I liked it a lot as an enterprise into history, as enjoying how historical narratives and stories have been told. It begins with a 2-hour or like 150-page like introduction about this guy finding the story in the history of Salem, Massachusetts, which is also where Hawthorne grew up. And it's very interesting. I would not say that the book has any literary value at all. Like, it's one of those stories where it's like, okay, this is interesting, but why are we teaching it in high school? Like, there are so many other books that talk about like slut shaming and like how women are portrayed in sexism and like, you know, the default of bureaucracy and how like, you know, it literally jokes at one point that if like there was more to do, these people wouldn't have spent so much time like being really bad to Hester. And I think that books like Tess of the D'Urbervilles or like other books do better at, you know, really getting into the main characters or the fallen woman head rather than just kind of, because it's like, yes, Hester is perfect and wonderful and she didn't deserve this. And like, we also never see the affair. I definitely enjoyed reading it. Like, it was fun to read and explore, especially since there's so many stories about it and like how it comes into our world today. But I didn't really enjoy it as a story. I enjoyed the literary experience of being like, oh, these are how these connections and this is interesting and how he formed this sentence. And because it's very metafiction as well, like he has a lot of references to how stories are told, and he's like alluding to the Salem witch trials because that happened in the 1600s and that's where he sets it too. And like he's really pulling on a lot of like, you know, folklore and on culture and like how we construct stories, how a man is different in his hometown. and all that, and that's super interesting. The story itself, it's like, I didn't enjoy, like, the story. I wasn't, like, enthralled by the characters or, like, interested in this, but I really enjoyed the experience of reading the book. I think there's many ways that people enter fiction. I think that there's lots of reasons that people enter fiction, and I used to be like, oh yes, I do it because of escapism, because, like, that's what everyone says. And the more I realize, it's like, I don't often read to just get swept up in a story. I read to analyze stories. So if you like analyzing stories and enjoy that aspect of it, this might be a very interesting book. If you want to be swept away in escapism, I would not recommend this at all. The next book on here was For Everyone by Jason Reynolds. I thought this was really good and really interesting. This is a poetry collection that was written before Jason Reynolds published. Jason Reynolds is a fairly well-known YA author who does beautiful poetry in verse, and novels. And I really enjoy his work in general, but this wasn't the best book for me. If you want to hear a glowing review, Kara from the Wild Garden gave it a glowing review, and I think that that can be something that a lot of people will enjoy. As a man in his mid-20s and late 20s, and about like how he had all of these dreams about, like, you know, I was going to be a millionaire by 25, and at 25 was the year I moved back in with my mother. And it's very realistic in that ways. The biggest issue that I had with it was a little bit too universal. Like, I thought the aspects when he was talking about his own story were really, really good, because for poetry, for me, it's like a very personal experience. I want to be right near the character. However, he spent a lot of time, like, kind of reaching out to people to try to encourage it, and that didn't hit me as much. For me, I feel like I tend to be more encouraged by people's personal stories. He wasn't trying to just be like, you know, solve this, keep believing. And, you know, he does acknowledge that, you know, sometimes your dreams won't happen. And that's something that's so important. Like, sometimes the things you want to happen will never happen. That does not mean that your life is worthless. It does not mean that your life is over. And it does not mean that just because you didn't have your dream accomplished, that you're somehow a failure. That dreams will happen maybe later in life, or maybe they won't happen, but you'll find new dreams. And that's something that's really important. I think that this is accessible to anyone, whether they like poetry or not. And I also think that a lot of people who are going through hard times will really appreciate this. The next book is A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. This is my very first full Dickens novels. I read Christmas Carol a long time ago, and this is my next book. And I've been also reading this for well over 2 years. And finishing it, I spent a lot of it being very frustrated and annoyed that, like, I just don't really understand the point. Like, I'm not that invested in these characters. And then we get to the final, like, third, the last half of the first part, when we're really steadily in the French Revolution. I really, really enjoyed it. The last chapters with what happens, spoiler related, in the end, beautiful. That last, like, paragraph and page, so good. I was literally talking to one of my friends this week, and he had A Tale of Two Cities, and he was like, yes, I hated everything other than the last page. And I was like, okay, I enjoyed more than the last page. So for me, a lot of it was gonna be like 3 points, because, like, again, it's very easy to like Charles Dickens stories. Like, I was like, I'm not invested in the characters, but I never was like, I hate this story. I was just like, you know, I'm just not, like, involved. And for me, being emotionally attached to something is important. Being able to feel something for the characters is important. And for this, I spent a lot of the time being like, I'm not really sure what the point is. The end, gorgeous. The writing, beautiful. Those were all books that I read in the first week of September, and then the rest, I barely read anything for the rest of September and really, really struggled. So the first one is Autumn, and this is by Ali Smith. It is very, very strong literary fiction. We have this guy who, we begin with him in his dreams, and he is, like, seeing all of these really, like, surrealist things, and then we have this girl in a post office who is trying to get her passport renewed, and we have these stories of when she's young and how he taught her about art. If you've read The Pursuit of Love, it made me think very clearly of, there's a scene in which our main character is introduced to art and culture, and she just becomes, like, swept away with that. And that's what I thought about. It has a lot of, like, concentration on the era of, like, Brexit and what it means to be leaving the EU, and what does contemporary British life look like. I know a lot of people really love this. I didn't dislike it. I also just didn't feel overwhelmingly powerful. Like, I feel like that's overall my feeling of this month, that there's a lot of books that I enjoyed in the moment, but I'm losing the threads of so quickly. Like, a few weeks later, after, like, 2 other books, I'm like, I can't remember. The next book that I read was Whereabouts by Jumpa Lahiri, and I absolutely loved this. Like, I really, really enjoyed following this story. So she's an acclaimed writer, the winner of the Pulitzer Prize in her debut short stories, which I'm reading currently, and so good. and I really, really liked her style. She is an Indian American. She spent a lot of time traveling and being uprooted and moving and being the only person of color in her class. Now she lives in Italy a lot of the times. This was written in Italian and then translated by her, and it's super cool and lyrical and wonderful. And she's looking at this woman. One of the central questions she talks about while writing this book is about the fact that she's asking the question of her life was so marked by traveling and being off-centered her whole life. What would it mean for a woman to live her entire life in one place and to have the opposite of her of like what happens when your dreams don't happen and what it means to move on? And I thought it was a really intimate look into all of these things when also not really revealing the narrator a lot in her own thoughts. I like stories where we don't get a lot of what the narrator's actual like physical life may look like when revealing a lot about their emotional life. The next book reminded me a lot of this, and it was a very negative experience, and this was outlined by Rachel Cusk. If you want to hear my whole thoughts, I have a September vlog, which I will link above, which I go off on this book. I thought it was going to be super cool. I've heard a lot of negative reviews, but I'm like, this is going to be a book because it's about this woman in her 40s who goes on a writing retreat where she is teaching people about writing in Greece, and it's her story, but she only doesn't really reveal much about herself, but instead reveals stories about other people through her life. So she pretty much just sits down and has this story where they reveal their whole life story and she barely talks. And I appreciate this because especially as a woman, it's very understanding when you have someone just kind of dominate the conversation, be like, here's everything, but you're not really given time to tell. And, you know, these are pretty awful people or people who, you know, change the story and adapt it, and you wonder about the full, you know, reliableness of their narration. And I thought that was really interesting. We go through about 8 people's lives, and by the time we got to the 3rd and 4th, I was just very exhausted by it. It brings up a lot of like misogyny, sexism, really bad representation of mental health and fat phobia, and just all these really toxic ideas. And she has nothing to say that these people are wrong. You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of assumed that these people are not super like great people, but after a while it just becomes exhausting. And I understand that like it's not necessarily the narrator's or the author's job to like come in and corral the morality of their characters, but it's just like if you're using this to critique misogyny, but I'm just being like sunken deeper and deeper in like the ocean of misogyny when reading it, it's just not that enjoyable. So like I might give Rachel Cusk another try, but this book was just a little bit too much. Like some lines were written beautifully, and I just, because there was not anchor of the main character, because we know nothing about her, I just felt lost and exhausted. If it had been a short story collection, I might have enjoyed it more. The next book, I don't have a lot to say about it. It's Written in the Stars, and this is a queer sapphic story about these 2 girls who fall in love. It's a pseudo retelling of Pride and Prejudice, where we kind of have our Darcy character who is, you know, a more upper class, well, you know, in finance, and then we have this girl who is an aspiring astrologist and writer, and they clash a lot. It doesn't have the most Pride and Prejudice things other than there's kind of a hate to love, and I really enjoyed the family dynamics and talked extensively about them in that vlog, and then was disappointed by the fact that they were completely unresolved and that the romance wasn't very deep. Like, we had these characters that were really interesting on their own, but they never really had any interesting conversations or reasons to connect as a couple. We have Lincoln and the Bardo, and this disappointed me a lot. I've been putting this off reading for a while because I wasn't sure if it was going to be my book, and I should have continued doing that because it wasn't my book. Pretty much we have Lincoln's son who died when he was 11 years old. This is a historical fact. We know that he went back and took his son's body out of the crypt several times to hold him, and we kind of have this analysis of this and what would happen if there was ghosts to kind of a purgatory where they can't move on because they have unresolved feelings. And it's interesting. Like, I liked hearing their backstories. I thought that was super cool, but the actual part in the ghosts or Lincoln's parts just didn't do anything for me. There's just sometimes an odd feeling when I read books. Sometimes there's books, there was nothing necessarily bad about it. I just did not like jive with it at all. And this was this book. Like, I was just annoyed and frustrated through most of it when it wasn't talking about the backstories of people's lives. And it was confusing. There's a lot of characters, and maybe that was because I read it narration. Like, it's known for its 166 narrations, but a lot of it just wasn't. And I have in my review kind of conversations about how I don't think that race was also handled very well. All of the people that are slaves in this afterlife are all people that are like, but my masters were super good. And it's like, okay, we do know that some slave masters were not as evil as others. However, to paint every single one of them that way, it isn't showing the outlier. It almost feels like a slave owner apology, and I'm sure that's not what he meant, but it definitely came across that way. Last and certainly not least, we have You Hold Me Up, and this is Indigenous picture book, which I really, really enjoyed. I have a review and kind of my thoughts and feelings around picture books and how I want to read more of them in the future, and I will link that up there as well. And yeah, those were my books for September. A lot of middle of the road books, a lot of books that I enjoyed in theory but didn't enjoy the story very much. I'm really hoping October will be a better reading month. I would love to end this with you giving me a book that you get out of a slump, because I desperately, desperately need that. And otherwise, happy reading, and I will see you next time.